A Maine banker named Andy Dufresne is found guilty of killing his wife and her lover, a professional golfer, in 1947. He receives 2 consecutive life sentences and is transferred to the notoriously harsh Shawshank prison because Maine does not have a death penalty. Despite Andy's repeated denials of guilt, everyone believes he is the one who committed the crime due to his cold and cunning personality. Ellis Boyd Redding, also known as Red, who served 20 years in prison for murder, is currently being considered for release. Red's parole application is denied despite his best efforts and conduct, but this doesn't bother him much. Red is then shown to be the neighborhood smuggler who can obtain prisoners anything they want as long as it is reasonable. All convicts are informed of the coming of visitors via an alarm. Red and his friends wager on which new fish will experience a panic attack on his first night in jail. Red makes a sizable wager on Andy. The first night, an obese newcomer known as Fat Ass breaks and begins to sob hysterically, which helps Haywood win the wager. The joy, however, is short-lived when Byron Hadley, the chief guard, brutally beats the overweight man for failing to keep silent when he was told to. Andy, meanwhile, keeps his composure and resolve. The convicts find out the following morning that Fat Ass passed away in the hospital because the prison doctor was out for the evening. A month or so later, Andy approaches Red since he's heard he's good at discovering stuff. He asks Red to help him find a rock hammer, which he believes is essential for his hobby of collecting and carving rocks. Red asks Andy about his motives, but Andy laughs them off. Red agrees to provide the order and cautions Andy about the Sisters, a gang of inmates who commit sexual assaults on other inmates, particularly their leader Boggs, who has feelings for Andy. Red also agrees to give the order. The other convicts view Andy as a really cold fish, but Red immediately takes a liking to him. Red speculates that Andy is planning to use the hammer to create an escape in the future, but when he finally realizes the enormity of the object, he realizes why Andy laughed and joins in, dismissing the idea that Andy could ever use the instrument to dig his way out of jail. Andy spends the majority of his time during the first 2 years of his time behind bars fending off Boggs and the Sisters or working in the prison laundry. Andy is frequently beaten and assaulted but doesn't speak out about it since he continually fights them off. Red uses his connections to get Andy and a couple of their common friends placed on a work detail to tar the roof of one of the prison's buildings, providing everyone with a respite from the monotony. Andy overhears Hadley grumbling about having to pay taxes for a future inheritance while he is at work. Andy explains to Hadley how he might hide his money from the IRS by using it to make a one-time present for his wife, drawing on his experience as a banker. Then, in exchange for some cold drinks for his fellow inmates while on the tarring job, he promises to help Hadley fill out the paperwork. Before agreeing to provide the inmates who are laboring cold beers before the job is finished, Hadley first threatens to throw Andy from the roof. Red says that although Andy may have contrived the privilege to win the respect of the guards as well as his other prisoners, he also may have done it just to feel normal again. While watching a movie, Andy approaches Red and makes another odd request: Rita Hayworth. Red is taken aback by the request, but nevertheless decides to place the order. Andy runs into the Sisters once more as he leaves the theater. He manages to argue his way out of being assaulted, but after being viciously battered to within an inch of his life, he spends a month in the hospital. Due to the beating, Boggs is kept in isolation for a week. He discovers Hadley and his men waiting for him in his cell as he exits. He is taken to a prison hospital upstate after being beaten so severely that he would never again be able to walk or consume solid food. The Sisters leave Andy alone and never bother him again. When Andy leaves the hospital, Red and his buddies have left him some pebbles to sculpt in a massive Rita Hayworth picture in his cell as welcome home presents. After learning that Andy had assisted Hadley, Warden Samuel Norton conducts an unexpected cell inspection to assess Andy. While the guards are turning the cell upside down looking for contraband, he finds Andy reading his copy of the Bible, and they chat about their favorite verses. The warden leaves after their interaction, almost forgetting to return Andy's Bible. Then he tells Andy that salvation lies within and encourages him to keep reading the Bible. Later, Andy is informed that he will now collaborate with senior convict Brooks Hatlin in the library. The reason for his relocation becomes clear when a jail officer arrives and requests Andy's financial advice. Andy sets up a temporary workstation and gets to work, giving most jail guards financial advice and assisting them with their tax filings. Andy also sees a chance to increase the jail library, so he begins by requesting funding from the Maine State Senate. Every week he sends letters. Even guards from neighboring prisons seek out Andy's financial advice when they visit for inter-prison baseball games because they value his financial support practice so highly. Andy is also helping the warden with his tax returns. Soon later, Brooks loses it and declares that he will kill Haywood if he is released on parole. Andy is able to reason with him. After spending 50 years in Shawshank, Brooks has clearly become institutionalized, as his buddies point out when they debate his behavior. Red understands this. He is unable to adjust to the outside world because he has practically been trained to live as a prisoner for the rest of his life. "These walls are funny," says Red. "You initially despise them before coming to accept them. Once enough time has passed, you begin to rely on them." After being granted parole, Brooks moves into a halfway house. Additionally, he receives a job at a grocery, which he despises. He eventually commits suicide after finding it unable to adjust to life outside of prison and leaves the note "Brooks was here" etched on a wooden beam. Andy receives $200 from the state for the library along with a selection of vintage books and recordings after 6 years of letter writing. The state senate believes that this will be sufficient to convince Andy to stop his letter writing campaign, but he is undeterred and increases his efforts. Andy discovers a copy of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro among the donated old records when they are delivered to the warden's office. He plays the song over the prison's public address system while locking the guard tasked with guarding the warden's office in the restroom. The music quickly has the entire prison entranced. Red observes that everyone felt liberated by the sounds of these women, if only for a time. Andy is told to switch off the record player by Norton, who can be seen outside the office fuming over the act of defiance. Andy reacts by increasing the volume. Hadley is instructed to break into the office by the warden, and Andy is promptly placed in solitary confinement for 2 weeks. When he emerges, he confesses to his companions that the stretch was the easiest time he had spent in the hole because he did it while listening to Mozart's Figaro for solace. He talks on the strength of hope in prison and how it may sustain them when the other inmates tell him how unlikely it is. Red vehemently disagrees with Andy and advises him to get used to life without hope, saying it is risky in a place like Shawshank. Red gets up from the table furious when Andy suggests that Brooks actually done what he said he would. Soon after, Red learns he has been imprisoned for 30 years at a new parole hearing. He speaks exactly like he did 10 years prior, but without any enthusiasm. Once more, his parole is denied. Red responds by presenting Andy a massive Marilyn Monroe poster to commemorate his 10 years after Andy presents him with a harp to mark his 30 years. The state senate ultimately decides that they won't get rid of Andy with just another check about 4 years after the Mozart incident. So they give him $500 per year to start his library. In order to build the best prison library in the state and to honor Brooks, Andy uses it wisely and strikes deals with book groups and charitable organizations. With a larger library and greater resources, Andy starts mentoring prisoners who want to graduate from high school so they may find decent employment when they are released. In the meantime, Warden Norton takes advantage of Andy's information and comes up with a plan to hire prisoners to work on government projects that he wins by undercutting other contractors prisoners make for cheap labor. On occasion, if the bribe is good enough, he lets other contractors win jobs. Using the fictitious identity of Randall Stevens, a man who only exists on paper, whom Andy himself established through his knowledge of the system and mail order forms, Andy launders the money by opening many accounts in multiple institutions and making multiple investments. The formal documents for Randall Stevens are his birth certificate, social security number, and driver's license. If anyone were to look into the scheme, they would be chasing a man who only existed on paper. Andy shares the details with Red, noting that he had to go to prison to learn how to be a crook. To do time for breaking and entering, a young prisoner named Tommy comes to Shawshank in 1965. Andy and Red make friends with Tommy because he is affable, charismatic, and well-liked by the other prisoners. Andy advises Tommy to think about a different line of business besides theft because he seems to be not very good at it. Tommy confesses that he has been in and out of prison since he was 13 years old. The idea truly resonates with Tommy, who seeks Andy for assistance in working toward a high school equivalency credential. Tommy is a good student, but even so, he becomes upset during the exam and crumples it up before throwing it away. Even so, Andy gets it and sends it in. Tommy inquires about Andy's situation, which Red answers. When Tommy hears the tale, he appears upset. He then shares with Andy and Red the tale of a former cellmate from a different jail who boasted about killing a professional golfer at the country club he worked at together with his lover. The woman's banker husband had served time in prison for those killings. With this fresh information, Andy meets with the warden full of optimism and expects Norton to assist him in obtaining a new trial with Tommy as a witness. Norton's response is exactly the opposite of what Andy had hoped for. The warden gets irate and sends Andy to isolation for a month when he vehemently states that he will never divulge the money laundering methods he set up for Norton over the years. The prisoners talk about the sentence, noting that it is the longest period of time spent in isolation that they have ever heard of. The fact that Andy has served over 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit and may actually be innocent dawns on them as well. Tommy receives word from the school board that he passed the test and has earned a high school diploma. In his alone cell, Andy receives the news from a guard, who makes him smile a little. Later, Tommy is taken outside in the dark to meet with the warden in private. He is questioned by Warden Norton about the veracity of the tale he told Andy and about his willingness to testify on Andy's behalf. Tommy wholeheartedly concurs. Before directing Hadley to shoot the man dead, the warden grinned at him. When the warden pays Andy a visit in seclusion, he informs him that Tommy attempted to flee and that Hadley was forced to shoot him. In response, Andy tells Norton that everything stops and that he will no longer be working for him. Andy doesn't buy Norton's explanation. If Andy refuses to work for him, the warden threatens to close the library, burn all the books, and transfer him to a very different cell in a very different area of the prison with the most seasoned offenders. He then departs and gives Andy another month in seclusion to reflect. When Andy finally leaves solitary confinement, he and Red have a conversation in which Andy discusses how much he loved his wife and how he still feels guilty for her death even though he did not shoot her. Then, if he were to ever be released from prison, he would discuss his projects. He talks of his desire to spend the rest of his life in Zihuatanejo, a seaside town on Mexico's Pacific coast, where he would also like to run a hotel. He then asks Red if he'd like to join him, but Red replies that he thinks Sandy is like Brooks and is too far gone and declines. Then, he blames Andy for allowing Hope to affect his thinking in such a way, saying that doing so will only lead to his demise. Red is asked whether he is familiar with the Buxton, Maine region as Andy accepts and prepares to leave. Then he describes to Red a very particular hayfield with a big oak tree at the end of a stone wall. Then, he requests Red's assurance that, should he ever be released from prison, he will look for that oak tree and find something that was buried amid the stones, but he won't specify what it is. Red makes a commitment, but he worries about how his pal is feeling. When he finds out that Andy has asked Haywood for a 6-foot rope, his concerns are only increased. Red thinks Andy may be on the verge of committing to unaliving himself because he has finally reached his breaking point. Before turning in for the evening, Norton requests that Andy shine his shoes and dry clean his suit. As the guards turn out the lights for the evening, Andy goes back to his cell. It was the loneliest night of Red's life, he says. The next morning, Andy is not in front of his cell as he usually is and has not returned the morning call. As he approaches Andy's cell, the guard screams at him for being late and expects to find a critically ill or dead Andy there. Norton is shocked when he discovers Andy's sneakers in his shoebox rather than his own. The alarm then sounds, alerting staff to a missing prisoner. Andy's cell is vacant as Norton comes in and demands an explanation. Red is brought in by Hadley, but Red insists he is unaware of Andy's plans. Norton begins tossing Andy's carved pebbles around the cell as he grows more aggressive and paranoid. He throws one at Andy's Raquel Welch poster, which had previously featured Rita Hayworth and Marilyn Monroe, and it punches through and into the wall. A tunnel that is barely broad enough for a man to crawl into is shown as Norton pulls the poster from the wall. In a series of flashback scenes recounted by Red, it is revealed that many years prior, soon after acquiring his rock hammer, Andy inadvertently attempted to etch his name on his cell wall when a piece of it broke off. Geology enthusiast Andy understood that the substance the wall was constructed of could allow him to create a hole if he ever wanted to escape. Andy initially requested the enormous Rita Hayworth poster to cover the gap. After that, he spent years using his rock hammer to dig at night while concealing the soil from his work in his pockets, which he would later unload in the courtyard on his morning walks. When Tommy was killed, Andy decided it was time to go. Andy wore Norton's clothes underneath his own to his cell during the storms the night before, and he was fortunate that no one, even Red, noticed Norton's sparkling black shoes on his feet. He put a lot of his stuff, some papers, and Norton's clothes in a plastic bag that he secured to himself with the rope he had requested, then he crawled out of his hole with everything in the bag. The tunnel he had dug took him to a spot between the prison's two walls, where he discovered a sewer main line. He smashed the sewer line with a rock multiple times in sync with the lightning strikes, eventually breaking it open. Andy emerged in a creek beyond the fortifications after crawling through 500 yards of the pipe's untreated sewage. Later, a search team discovered his jail uniform, a bar of soap, and a very rusted rock hammer. Andy enters the Maine National Bank in Portland, where he had deposited Norton's money, as the warden and Red are learning of his brilliant escape from capture. He closes the account and leaves with a cashier's check while posing as Randall Stevens and carrying all the required paperwork. He asks them to ship a parcel for him before he departs. Soon later, in order to cover the unfolding story, many reporters and the Maine State Police storm Shawshank Prison. Hadley is detained by the state police after being accused of killing Tommy. Warden Norton finally opens the safe in his office that he hadn't touched since Andy escaped and discovers the Bible he had given Andy along with a note to the warden stating that he was correct. Salvation did lay within, as Hadley is taken away in a police squad car and the local district attorney enters the prison with several policemen holding a warrant for Norton's arrest. As the police knock on Norton's door, he returns to his desk, pulls out a little pistol, and shoots himself once in the head to end his life. Shortly after, Red receives an unwritten postcard from Fort Hancock, Texas. Red interprets it as proof that Andy managed to enter Mexico and find freedom. Red and his friends pass the time by discussing Andy's escapades, with a few embellishments, but Red develops a sadness because he misses his comrade. Red tells the parole board at his subsequent parole hearing in 1967 that the term rehabilitated was simply made up to support their position. Then he goes on to say how much he regrets his earlier deeds, not because he's in jail but rather because he realizes how bad they were. Finally, he asks the board to stop wasting his time and leave him alone, adding that he will have to live with that decision for the rest of his life. Finally, he is given parole. He moves into the same homes and workplaces that Brooks did, even observing the message Brooks had inscribed on the wooden beam. He regularly passes a pawn shop with multiple guns displayed in the window. The vow he made to Andy keeps him from considering trying to return to prison when he feels like he has no life outside of the prison where he has spent the majority of his adult life. Then he says that he was actually looking at the compasses hidden beneath the firearms, and that's why he bought one. Red follows Andy's advice, taking a bus to Buxton, where he finds the stone wall he was told about. There is a sizable black stone, as Andy had mentioned. A tiny box with a significant amount of cash and instructions to come find him in Zihuatanejo sits underneath, though he doesn't specify the location just in case. Additionally, he claims that he needs a person who can get things for a project of his. Red is suddenly aware of the full potential of hope and is ecstatic about the emotions he is experiencing. Red violates his parole and departs the halfway home after carving a new message that reads, "Brooks was here, so was Red," into a wooden beam. Red is worried by this because no one is expected to conduct a thorough quest for an old crook like him. Red commutes by bus to Fort Hancock, from where he enters Mexico. Just as Andy had hoped, the two buddies are at last reunited on a beach along the Pacific coast.